Good evening. Welcome back to Front Page Close-Up. This is part 2 of our discussion with Stanley Kurtz, the author of the new book, Radical in Chief. Stanley, welcome back to the program.
Jamie, thanks for having me.
Let me begin with this. Who schooled Obama? Let's talk about some of the people that were his mentors, some of the people who supported him, and I think even more importantly, who he looked up to. What did you find in your research?
Well, Jamie, first there was a period from about 1983 to 1985 when Barack Obama lived in New York City. And as I describe at the beginning sections of the book, in those years Obama attended a series of socialist scholars conferences in New York City. And there he encountered some of the leading lights of contemporary socialism, some of the leading lights of socialist community organizing. For example, Francis Fox Piven, famous, even infamous theorist of community organizing, addressed those conferences that Obama attended. Her idea was, of course, originally that you should flood the American welfare system with applicants to the point where you'd cause a financial crisis for state and local governments, and in that way eventually you'd stampede the federal government into creating a guaranteed annual income, and that would be a way of bringing socialism toward the United States. Now, when Obama was going to these conferences, Piven's idea had changed. She was focused on the electoral system. Her idea was that you develop a system through organizations like Project Vote, which Obama ended up working for later in his career, to register poor and minority people who previously had not voted. But you do it in such a way as to create a movement. You try to create a class-based conflict between the poor people who you're registering to vote and business interests and the Republican Party. And in this way, ultimately, you realign the Democratic and Republican parties around the issue of class conflict. And the thought was, if you could just make class conflict, a battle between the haves and the have-nots, the central issue of American politics, then eventually, over the long term, the have-nots would gravitate towards socialism.
Okay, let me ask this. Obama's rise to power, mostly supported by? Who is he supported by? Who supported him? Where did he get this power from?
Well,
in your book you talk about that in Chicago it's mostly the socialist world.
Absolutely. After Obama attended these socialist conferences, he moved to Chicago and became a community organizer. Now, these socialist conferences in New York were touting the work of a group of community organizers in Chicago who were clustered around an organization called the Midwest Academy. The Midwest Academy was run by some of the most powerful socialists in America in the post-60s era. People haven't heard of these folks because we don't know the history of contemporary socialism. That's what I tell in the book. But they were community organizers and prominent socialists, and they singled out Obama as someone who was ready for the big time, so to speak. They helped move him up the ladder of Chicago politics. To give an example, Alice Palmer is the woman who Obama replaced in his first elective office. She was a state senator in Illinois, representing the Hyde Park district, and she chose Obama as her successor. What people didn't know until recently, when I did my research, is that Alice Palmer was very much a part of this Midwest Academy network. She was very closely connected to these socialist community organizers who had these ideas about keeping your socialism secret.
Right.
And she had access to people who had worked with Obama for years to know his true political convictions when she chose him as her successor.
Okay, so what I'm getting at too here, to crystallize this here, is socialists are not, you don't see socialist community organizers, you know, that tried to help Ronald Reagan get into power. There's a reason why these people supported Obama. If socialists support you, it might mean it's because that they think that you think like them.
Right, and I'm careful about this in the book, Jamie. Socialists support a lot of people who themselves aren't necessarily socialist. But there are very particular cases. For example, when Obama did first run for the Illinois State Senate, he was one of only about 4 officials in the Chicago area that got an official endorsement of the Democratic Socialists of America. Now that was a very carefully selected endorsement. That wasn't just a group of socialists saying, we're going to endorse all the Democrats because that's the best we can do right now. They carefully selected 3 or 4 people who they felt were sympathetic to their ideas. They knew him closely because he had been at the University of Chicago, and a lot of his students and people at the university that he knew were members of the Democratic Socialists of America, and that endorsement is a very meaningful endorsement.
Okay. Now, Stanley, you're dealing with, you know, what I think is a huge pathology in our culture, in the sense that you have to also be careful because, you know, there's a very bad reputation that kind of for people who point the finger at others for being socialists. You get accused of being McCarthyite, et cetera, and I'd like you to talk about that for a minute, but I'd like to precede my question with this, is that it's usually socialists themselves who are pointing the finger at people calling them McCarthyites, but they themselves support socialist values and socialist principles. So this is a bit confusing in the sense that it's usually people that support, like I said, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, all their views are socialist, and yet they don't want to be called socialists. I mean, Barack Obama had, you know, Anita Dunn and Van Jones, you know, around him. These were people that glorified Mao, were self-professed, you know, Van Jones was a self-professed communist. How do you deal with this in terms of being perhaps trying to avoid being accused of being a kind of McCarthy figure, but at the same time, these are socialists that you're dealing with?
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I think it's a matter of political honesty, really. I mean, I'm not in favor of blacklisting socialists, as people did back in the McCarthy era. Take Senator Bernie Sanders. He's openly socialist. I wouldn't vote for him, but I'm not calling for him or his followers to be punished. But at least Bernie Sanders is out in the open. You can't have democracy if you don't have honesty from a politician about their political beliefs. Now, I was one of the people who preferred not to talk about socialism. I wrote a lot about Obama during the 2008 campaign. I wasn't shy about calling him a radical or saying that he was far to the left of the way he advertised himself. But I thought the socialism issue was sticky. It was turned on complicated questions of definition. Sure, I didn't want to be accused of being a McCarthyite or whatever. But then, when I got a contract to write a book about Obama's past, I was obligated to tell the truth. And I went back and looked at the record. And again, he's working with people who are sponsoring his political career who see themselves as socialists. That's how they think about themselves. In fact,
but they don't like people calling them socialists.
That's right. And in fact, there was even a group of socialists who criticized these stealthy community organizers. They accused them from the left of being stealth socialists because there were some socialists who said, let's go before the American public, tell them what we believe. We believe in the end they will support us, just like, say, Bernie Sanders has done. So if you're going to be loyal to the facts as you find them, there are, in fact, a group of community organizers who see themselves as socialists. They're prominent socialists in the country, and yet they don't want to talk about it. And these people exist. I found their archives. I've read their writings. I had to talk about it.
Let me ask this, in terms of that wall that you come up against, because there's obviously an attempt to camouflage a lot of the past and what these people really stand for. You talk about Obama's secret in this book, but apparently you had a little bit of a secret about writing this book. Can you tell us about it?
Well, during the 2008 campaign, some research I did helped to inject the Bill Ayers issue into the campaign. There had been some talk about Obama having a relationship with Bill Ayers, and I found an archive that contained records of a foundation where Ayers and Obama had worked together. And there was a move to prevent me from getting into that archive. So when I signed the book contract, instead of announcing my project publicly, I purposely kept it secret because of a fear that my research would be interfered with. And so I had to conduct all of my research in great secrecy.
Before we end this second part, what do you mean it would be interfered with?
Well, our archivists at libraries have a significant amount of discretion. So if they didn't like my politics, they might try to block me. And who knows? I mean, we know now that one of Obama's old associates was the person who asked the Chicago archive to keep me out. Who knows what might have happened? You know, I'm not a mind reader, but after having had one unfortunate experience, I thought it was best to be discreet.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of part 2 of our interview with Stanley Kurtz. Join us for our final part tomorrow evening about our dialogue with Stanley Kurtz about Radical in Chief.